Aside from the occasional 120-volt alternating current tickle after flipping off the wrong breaker, the worst shock I have experienced was 450-volt direct current at a manufacturing plant where I used to work. Fortunately, it just traveled across one hand but hurt like hell. Does anyone else have a good story? Story 1. When I was a child, my father told me to unplug the air compressor that he was using outside. The grass was wet and the cord was damaged. I yanked the cord and it shocked me, causing me to fall backward. It hurt. By the way, I love that most of these stories start with, "When I was a child." Story 2. Photo flash capacitor from a disposable camera. It is not that bad, but it sure wakes you up fast. Edit. They hit between 200 to 400 plus volts direct current, apparently. Story 3. Horse's fence. It was not really that bad, but it felt like a massive punch in my chest. I was very surprised because at first, I had no idea what happened. Story 4. Electric fence across my back when going fishing in a farm pond cow pasture. I thought I had cleared it when I raised up from crawling under. Story 5. 7 9-volt batteries on the tongue. Yes, I did it intentionally. Yes, it was on a dare. No, I couldn't taste my breakfast the next morning. Story 6. Not a bad shock, but funny. I used to be a theater technician back in the 1980s. A lot of the old stage lights had asbestos cloth as insulation on the wires. Because it was fairly weak, it would often creep back from the connections and allow the body of the light to be live. One night, I was working alone in a theater, setting up the lights for a production. One of the lights was live, and so was the pipe mounted to the ceiling that the light was attached to. I was hanging lights, working off an aluminum ladder, and I was really tired. Every couple of minutes, I started to feel a little unsteady on the ladder, grabbed the pipe overhead, got a mild shock, cursed, and went back to working. After doing this 3 times, I finally moved to an area of pipes that were not live. Hilarious in retrospect 40 years later. Story 7. Finally, a really good question. A light bulb broke in the socket of a lamp, one of those clip-on desk lamps. Since the bulb was burned out, I couldn't really tell if the power was on or off, but no worries. I did the smart thing and unplugged the extension cord it was running on. Then I grabbed a pair of rubber-coated pliers and tried to get a grip on the metal base of the light bulb. As soon as I made contact, I felt a horrible jolt run through my entire body, and sparks came flying off the lamp. It was the weirdest feeling ever. You can feel it deep in your chest, and it is not only painful but eerily similar to that horrible emotional feeling that surges through you when you get hit in the groin. After the shock wore off, I was trying to figure out how I got shocked after taking all the usual precautions. Then I realized that I had pulled the wrong plug from the wall. I couldn't trace the actual cord because it was running behind a piece of furniture, but I was certain I knew which of the 2 cords it was. Clearly, I was wrong. This was only a few months ago. I don't want to imagine what a higher voltage shock would feel like. Story 8. I leaned my sweaty arm on the welding table a few times and became the ground. It definitely tingled way more than 120 volts from an outlet. Story 9. I worked as a merchandiser for Home Depot a few years ago. I had no real experience with electricity until then. Training was minimal at best. I was installing a light fixture in one of the displays and had wired it incorrectly. I touched the metal backing of the display wall and felt an extremely warm sensation grab my entire body. It took several seconds to pull my hand away from the wall. I was sore the next day with my lower back hurting the most. It was an interesting experience, not entirely unpleasant. Story 10. At a young age, while exploring on the farm, I discovered a newly constructed fence that was just my height and did not have the pointed spikes on it. I grabbed it with both hands and threw my leg over it to get across. That was when I discovered electricity. Story 11. Not mine, but I worked maintenance at an apartment complex. A coworker I was working with did not want to turn off the breaker while switching light fixtures. He got shocked so badly he flew 20 feet down the hall and had the stereotypical fried hair. Needless to say, we turned off the breaker after that. Story 12. When I was a kid, my cousin convinced me to do something. Pee on that wire. Why? Just do it. He convinced me to pee on an electrical fence. What a surprise that was. Story 13. Fixing a batting cage in high school. I thought I had flipped the right circuit breaker before I started, and that was a mistake on my part. Story 14. Lots. Electric fences as a kid. Taser. I was a security guard when I was younger. I am an electrician now. 277 volts was the worst I was hit by. Someone demoed a light and left exposed wiring under some insulation. Story 15. A girl I went to college with was experimenting with some tasers during a house party. Unfortunately, I found out instead of her. She says it was an accident, but considering I got hit, I don't believe her. Story 16. Doing pump work and there was a 50 horsepower motor. I was leaning on it. We turned off the breaker, but it was still connected to a capacitor. What the heck? My arm was sore for 2 days. Story 17. A lot probably are not here to tell their story. Rest in peace to all the shocked heroes of this century. Story 18. When I was 6 years old, my parents were doing renovations. I was very curious about where the current came from in the socket. I found a screwdriver from my father and removed the plastic protection from the socket. When I touched the wires, my eyes suddenly darkened, and I was shaken quite a bit. When I came to my senses, I realized what had happened, and since then, I have been very careful with any electrical work. Story 19. Switched a 480-volt circuit breaker once, but neglected to discharge a capacitor, and was shocked with approximately 400 amps into my hand. It hurt intensely, and I could not let go for a moment, which was very frightening. Story 20. When I was around 9 or 10, I was mowing the front yard with a corded electric mower. The extension cord had a wire sticking out near the plug, and when I went to unplug it, the wire stuck into my finger and knocked me down. I remember lying there shaking with an indescribable vibration going through my body. Luckily, my mother was sitting on the front step, ran over and pulled the cord away from me. I still have a round scar on my finger where the wire stuck me, and that was in the late 1960s. Story 21. I was delivering a clothes dryer to a customer and had to remove the old dryer, which was jammed between the wall and water heater. I wrestled with it for a while and was drenched with sweat. Finally, after getting frustrated, I wrapped myself around the dryer and gave it a good jerk. A sharp metal piece of the dryer cut into a wire on the water heater. You sure do make some funny sounds when it hits you. Story 22. Setting timing on a car using a multiple spark discharge ignition box. I guess the coil wire was not sealed very well, and it shocked me badly. A friend bought a handheld taser in the 1990s, one of those large brick-sized ones that can be heard from a mile away. He dared me to try it, so I tossed myself. Never again. Story 23. I took 277 volts elbow to knee. I heard someone grunt and I fell away from the energized part. Luckily, I woke up on the ground, called my wife, and cried. Then I went to the hospital. Electrical safety is not a joke. Story 24. 220 volts, from one hand to the other, across my chest. It knocked me out suddenly, just before I thought I was about to die. When I woke up, I smelled nothing but smoke for days. Story 25. About 300 volts direct current from a camera flash capacitor shocked me as a teenager, throwing me across the room. I remember blacking out for a few seconds. Story 26. I accidentally touched the 240-volt live wire on our water heater while adjusting the temperature. The current entered my right hand and exited through both my feet. My muscles tensed up, and I experienced severe chest pain, but I was fine after a few minutes. Story 27. Most dangerous? I touched the wires carrying 120 volts when my dad was rewiring the fridge outlet. It was brief. The most painful was when somebody zapped me with the cover off a disposal camera, probably over 200 volts. When you charged up the flash, the capacitor would give you a wicked jolt and leave a burn where the leads touched you. Story 28. Top 3 personal experiences. 3. 30 amp. 208-volt blower fan wiring damage. 277 volts actually had burn marks. Spark plug wire on a running engine knocked me down. I probably should have gone to the hospital. Story 29. I do not have an actual voltage or amperage rating for any of these, but intentional. One of my partners and I modified a knockoff violet wand to put out enough electricity to doodle on human skin at a width that left easily visible marks for weeks while trying to find the limits of my pain tolerance. Unintentional. The violet wand broke in a spectacular fashion. Let's just say I could taste it. Story 30. Not the worst, but by far the most annoying was while doing phone cross connects in an apartment. While trying to get the wires neatly lined up and ready to punch down, my sweaty bare arm would bump the block repeatedly. Story 31. When I was in college, I learned the hard way that LM78XX and LM79XX voltage regulators have different pinouts. Story 32. I do not know what the power level was, a standard outlet in a warehouse, but when I was young and inexperienced, I tried to pull a prong out of an outlet after it broke off from a vacuum without turning off the circuit breaker. I remember exactly how it felt. I feel like I got lucky, but I am not sure how lucky. Story 33. 3 legs of 480 volts to my hand. Estimated 300 volts DC hand to feet. Been nibbled by 277 volts a couple of times on oddball equipment. Fortunately, only the direct current was locked on. Discharge your capacitors. Lock it out. Do not work with frequency drives for 15 minutes after removing power. Electricity will kill you, and it will hurt the entire time. Story 34. I stuck a staple in an outlet as a little toddler. My mom says I screamed loudly but was fine otherwise. I shocked myself quite a few times recently on the coil of my 2000 Ranger while trying to diagnose a misfire while stranded in the middle of a remote area in Michigan. I kept saying whoa with my girlfriend in the passenger seat as this vehicle was barely running. She was not happy when I told her I kept getting shocked. Story 35. I was an electrician in the Navy. I was working on a system that controlled firefighting sprinklers on the vehicle deck. I know I turned the breaker off. Anyway, I was standing on an aluminum ladder, had one hand on the rail, and stuck my screwdriver into the controller. Then, I received a 450-volt alternating current shock that traveled up one arm, across my chest, and out the other arm. It threw me across the room where I slammed into the wall and slid to the floor. My heart was alternating between racing and slowing down for about 30 seconds. Then it settled, and I just sat there until I felt better. Then I went to check the breaker. I saw a red lockout tag sticking halfway out of the breaker cabinet door, which was not there when I shut it. The breaker was, of course, on. I'm guessing I had made an enemy. Story 36. I am about 10 years old, sitting in a bathtub with my right cheek touching the brass stopper and my back against the spigot, when lightning struck the transformer on the power pole on the street outside our yard that supplied electricity to our property. Someone had tied the grounds together, and my body was jolted into a solid-state shock that ejected me from the tub as my limbs convulsed. It was shocking. Story 37. Got a good jolt in Germany, only 220 volts, but enough to let me know not to do that again. Snapped my teeth together like an uppercut. Story 38. 1000 volts direct current from an insulation resistor tester from the 1960s. It was not made to be safe. Have you ever been kicked in the spine by a donkey? Me neither, but I know what it feels like. Story 39. I'll have to explain first. Theater and rock shows used to use lights called parabolic reflector cans. These were round aluminum or steel tubes that had a parabolic reflector lamp inside them. You could put a sheet of colored cellophane on the front for color. They were called parabolic reflector lamps because they had a parabolic reflector and came with different lenses depending on the beam angle you wanted. Because of the way the filament was arranged, the light that came out of these was more of an oblong shape than round. They were designed so that you could change the parabolic reflector lamp in the can to the beam angle you wanted, and had an insulated ceramic lamp base that plugged into the back of the lamp. You commonly reached into the back of the can and gripped the base to spin the lamp so you could direct the oblong light the way you wanted. I was head technician on a show and was up on a cherry picker pointing all the parabolic reflector cans in the right direction when I reached into the back of a can to spin the beam. One of the wires going to the lamp base was missing some insulation. 240 volts went straight through me, and the shock just about threw me out of the cherry picker basket. Story 40. Caught my finger between two prongs in an electrical outlet. Shocked myself by effectively turning my body into a fuse while replacing a fuse. Gave myself a shock grabbing a pull chain from the ceiling light and refrigerator. Those are the first few that come to mind. I think the fuse incident was the worst. Story 41. 480 volts locked and tagged. Checked switches. A ground was shorted and caused the screwdriver I was holding to blow up. If it had not popped, I would probably be a statistic. I still have my fingers, but could not feel them for a few minutes. Story 42. I've been tossed, and yes, it sucks. However, a long time ago, I was working on a project using an old trash pump. My supervisor was not a fan of preventative maintenance, and this engine had no boot on the spark plug. I slipped in the mud, fell on the pump, grounding the spark plug with my body. I stayed until I shut off the pump engine. It was worse than being tossed. 0 out of 10 would not recommend. It was a terrible experience. Story 43. While on the backside of a Varian ion vacuum system, my supervisor was in charge of the breakers on the front that control high voltage to the ion pump's direct current voltage of 5,000 volts. After a lower clean involving 8 pumps with it open, you turn on the high voltage to burn carbon off the newly cleaned ion pumps. Every time you open the lower end, a circular liquid nitrogen cold trap has to be removed with the breaker off, as instructed by my supervisor. I was in my late 20s when the current passed through my hand to my upper inside forearm. It blinded me for a minute or so, and I developed a golf ball-sized knot in my forearm. Story 44. Just last week, I was shocked with 240 volts from one hand to the other and across my chest by a faulty appliance. I couldn't let go or see anything for about 3 seconds while being shocked. Luckily, my legs still had enough movement to pry my hands away. That was terrifying. Story 45. I have handled 240 volts manually and have been shocked by 277 volts. I may do live electrical work more often than I should. However, most of these incidents occurred before I discovered insulated tools. Those were not my proudest moments. I had not done live work for a couple of years until about a week ago, when I was replacing a 24-volt direct current power supply in a projector enclosure. I mistakenly forgot that one end of the power supply is connected to 120 volts and attempted to unscrew a lead with an uninsulated screwdriver while my finger was touching the shaft. Story 46. I wasn't shocked, but I got hit with the plug when I decided to put a spring between the two prongs on a charger and plug it in. I was 8 years old. Story 47. I was cutting wallpaper around a live electrical outlet and accidentally touched the metal with the knife. It shocked me backward a couple of feet, and I was dizzy for a few moments. Then, I felt more alive than ever for the next hour. I am so tempted to do it again. Story 48. Nailed by an electrical circuit. At the top of a 24-foot extension ladder, I had removed the wire nuts to get the sconce light mounting bracket over the wires to install the light. The circuit had been off. I was not locked and tagged out. I was also a new apprentice. Another apprentice turned the circuit on. While I slid the bracket over the wires with both hands, I made contact with energized wires. I felt it through my chest, specifically my solar plexus region. The hurt scared me. I'm lucky I did not fall off the ladder. I did not tell anybody for reasons that would take too long to explain. I went home that night certain I would die in my sleep. But I did not. I had no ill effects from it, but I learned a very valuable lesson. Story 49. Unprofessional electrician left a live wire exposed in my wall, and I accidentally touched it with my fingers. It caused a strange sensation and a rapid heartbeat for a short time. I do not recommend this experience. Story 50. When I was a child, around 7 years old, my neighbors had a big brick wall around their yard that went through some bushes and trees. It had a cool, fort-like feel. One afternoon, I decided to climb on top of it using a tree. I was crawling across the top and came to a spot where a lamp was supposed to be, but there were just live wires. My hand touched the wires, and I was thrown completely off the wall. I never told anyone because I did not want to lose my fort. Story 51. 480 through my boots. Luckily, I fell out of the spicy puddle and into safety, but I had to take a trip to the hospital afterward. Story 52. About 30,000 volts from a distributor wire on a truck. Low current, but still, that hurt a lot. The engine was running, and I heard this tick, 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 tick. I saw the wire had come off the plug, and I grabbed it to plug it back in while it was running. Lesson learned. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.